Hey guys, and welcome back to another Off the Cuff. I just thought with this war between Ukraine and Russia breaking out in inverted commas that we should have a quick chat, because in this day and age of polarization, when one side wants a particular person on the other side to take all the blame and then vice versa, regardless of whose side I'm on, most of you probably know where I stand roughly. I think it's good for people to sit back and just try and take a few sort of pieces of information from both sides in. So some of this that I put forward you might have heard before, and some you might not have. So first of all, I thought we would just sort of have a look at the geographic location, because I'm sure a lot of people don't know exactly where some of these countries, especially the smaller ones that are involved, are. Let's have a look-a-rooney. You've got Russia, but another important thing to note is China, which we'll come along to towards the end. But China down here, and China obviously borders Russia in the east, just around here. Japan as well borders Russia, at the moment, thankfully, we are just looking at this area here. So, Black Sea sort of area. 5 years ago, Russia took back this area here, the Crimean Peninsula, which was originally Russian, and we'll get onto that. There's a lot of history involved, and actually, we already knew that, but Putin kind of talked about it yesterday when he was declaring war. And then we have the state of the Ukraine, obviously bordering Russia, because it was part of the Ukraine. Ukraine means borderland, and part of that was the edge of Russia until the 1917 revolution. So here is the Ukraine. Down here is the Crimean Peninsula, and then if we zoom in, this sort of area here, although this is the problem, we thought it was going to be sort of around here. That was going to be Putin's sort of target. We thought he kind of wanted the southeast. But as it has turned out today, it looks like he's essentially got troops all along the northern border. So all along here, he's got troops. And obviously you've got Kiev right here. What he's saying is that he talked about the history of Russia, the history of the Ukraine, and how he feels like his back is up against the wall. That's what he says, because obviously NATO is trying to encourage the Ukraine to join NATO. Obviously, if the Ukraine joins NATO, because so many other states are either in the EU or NATO, I guess Putin feels that Russia would basically just be ripe for whatever the future holds. The interesting thing is that all the Russians that I've ever spoken to about this that are of a certain age where they could remember say that during the Cold War period, Russians were always hyper paranoid about the West, and it was one of those situations where they thought that we were going to do something, we thought they were going to do something, but really, obviously, for obvious reasons, neither side actually wanted to do anything. And from what I've heard, that kind of paranoia still exists to a degree in Russia. Like I say, this video today is not about taking sides. I've seen everyone going around today going, boo Russia, boycott Russia. Listen, can we just catch our breath and actually see what's going on, and not kind of blame the people for what's going on? Let's just find out what's happening first. Obviously, an important thing to note with regards to this sort of strategic grab as well is that Russia's ports at the moment, or let's say Russia's ports 10 years ago, essentially they had a port up in the north, which is basically the Arctic Circle, and that was it, really. They had another port in St. Petersburg, but it's very difficult for them to get out without NATO's permission, because you've got Denmark, Sweden, you've got Finland over here, Lithuania, Germany. There's a lot of different countries that have power that could stop them getting out of their port of St. Petersburg here. And as I say, their only other port that they had was in the north. Interestingly enough, probably not very interesting for some people, right here is where the biggest nuclear bomb ever in the history of the world went off. Yuzhny Island. Crazy. 50,000 megatons, I think, or kilotons, I don't know, whichever the bigger one. So those were their sort of 1.5 ports, if you like. They then made a deal with Syria to give them sort of full access, like to a port around here, and that worked for a time. But then obviously they've had so much war in Syria that it's just not logistically feasible to do that, and also they keep having to go through another country. So partly the fact that they wanted their own Mediterranean port, and partly to do with some of the things that we'll go on to, they basically decided to take back Crimea. And as I say, we will move on to the other aspect of that, because it's not just fair to say he just wanted their old port back, because this was originally a Russian port. But we've also heard rumblings, and also you can take this from what he said, that he might just be going for the majority of the Ukraine. Even if it's kind of slowly, that could be what he's going for. And also people have been talking about Moldova. He actually talked about Moldova as well, which is here. Obviously you have Odessa. This is all in Russia before, or the USSR. But some of this was still actual Russia, 100 years ago, 110 years. Okay, and then you've also got other countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, because this piece here is Russia. This is one of those weird things where a country, well, mind you, I guess the UK can't talk, we have territories in bizarre locations, but yeah. So in Kaliningrad, probably not saying that right, this is Russian, this is Russia. It just happens to be surrounded by other countries. And essentially, the way the Ukraine was made up was that in exchange with other empires, back probably 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, they sort of made a deal to make a new state, and that new state was made up of a chunk of Romania, a chunk of Poland, which was Prussia, so a chunk of Poland, a little bit of Hungary, a little bit of Slovakia, and a large part of Russia. And as I say, back then, the Ukraine was, how to describe it? I mean, New England, I guess, would be a good way of putting it to an American, or East Anglia for a Brit. It's more than just like a city or a state, but it's just like an area. So if you think of it as East Anglia or New England, that's kind of what it was 100 years ago. And so it's still called Ukraine, but it was part of Russia. So they took that, they took a few chunks of some other countries as a favor to Lenin, and they formed what we now know today as Ukraine. Okay, so now I'll briefly touch on what the two sides essentially say the reasons for the war are. So the West says that Putin is just a sort of power-hungry egomaniac. He wants to reignite the Soviet states to become one huge Russia again, and then he's going to keep chomping at Europe until he reaches the west coast of Ireland. Slightly exaggerated, but that's essentially what they're saying, is that he just wants more land and stuff. What he would say, and this is just what he said in the speech, it's I think it was an hour that he spoke to the people of Russia for. He went into a ton of details, as you would imagine, over an hour. He's obviously quite an articulate guy as well, so he's not dragging it out for a long time. But he went into tons of different areas. So he said that ever since the Ukraine had essentially been created by a bunch of crooks, it's been run by a bunch of crooks. Now, some people would say it takes one to know one. This is way too complicated to just be on one side or the other. But yeah, so he said that was one of the things he said. He said that the inheritance of the Ukraine from Russia was, technology, shipbuilding, farming, and all this sort of stuff. And he said, and what have you done with it? You've driven it into the ground. Your own people are struggling. They're struggling with their pensions. They're struggling with good wages. They're struggling with holiday time, and all these different things that he went into. Some of them are true. Some of them are a bit exaggerated. He talked about how he's sat and watched over the last 20 years as NATO and the EU sort of get stronger and stronger and pushes closer and closer to the border of Russia. Which is true, and he doesn't feel particularly comfortable seeing missile launchers being wheeled into the Ukraine, into Ukraine, as in the borderland. But yeah, so he said, it's what am I supposed to do when we have somewhere that was, like many other places, that was an old ally of ours, and now they're essentially being sort of bought off, if you like, but this is what he said, being bought off by NATO, by the EU, by the West. I'm just going to end up with a ton of hostility literally on my doorstep. Because I think that's something that Brits well, maybe not Brits quite so much, but definitely Brits nowadays, and Americans obviously don't really fully understand, which is it's very rare that either of those countries ever have war on their doorstep. So I imagine if there was a country that was very, very hostile and far more powerful than you are, because you have to imagine, Russia has the sort of fiscal power of less than Italy. They're pretty far down in terms of money. So they've got the EU, then they've got NATO, and sort of the US backing everyone up, and obviously the US is involved with NATO as well, literally on their doorstep. So that would be like if there was a country more powerful than America, so let's say China in 20 years, China and another huge union literally sitting on the Canadian border. Yeah, can imagine that. Or the Mexican border. You're having missile placements sat literally in Tijuana. America would definitely not like that. And Russia doesn't like it. Obviously, I don't believe that there is a need for them to invade Ukraine. Ukraine in itself is quite interesting because it's not a place where it's sort of 90% pro-Ukrainian or even like 90% pro-European. There is a large proportion of Ukrainians that would consider themselves more Russian than European. So that's interesting. But obviously, I've spoken to people that also say the other way around, which is they definitely enjoy being European, being Ukrainian, and they don't want to become Russian. And I think you find that in all countries. There's definitely people in the UK that wish they weren't part of the UK. There's people in the UK that love being part of the UK. Same in America. But yeah, so my one theory that I have, because obviously, because you had Trump, who was very, listen, we need to come together and at least be able to speak to each other to avoid these types of things, and that was the way he was with Putin, and that was the way he was with Xi Jinping to a degree. Obviously, they had to fight the trade war and stuff, and the intellectual property stuff, so he was not so keen then. But for the majority of the time, his deal was, I've got my country to control, to deal with, you've got your country to deal with, I'm going to do the best for my country. And now we've kind of gone back, no offense to anyone that's a big Biden dude, but we've kind of gone back to this place where we just throw insults at Russia and we just throw accusations. I mean, in this case, the accusations were completely founded, but we throw things around and then we don't talk to them. So no wonder they're paranoid. They see on all these newspapers and everything bad seems to be called Russian. So they probably see a lot of that and think, like, what's going on? So yeah, I can kind of understand the paranoia. And we've essentially pushed them into the arms of the Chinese now, because if anybody didn't know, they had a long, several-day hangout, did Putin and Xi Jinping. That's very worrying, because as anybody that is sort of in the know is aware of, China is set to be around twice as powerful as the United States by 2050, and on parity by 2032, I think it is now. It was 2035. Part of me wonders, because if you have a look at this side of the map, whether or not this is a very sort of dastardly plan by China to get Russia to fight a war on that front and become sort of a bit weakened, while they find a way of moving up on this side. Even if it's not now, if there's a big war, and let's hope there isn't because of the sorts of weapons we have nowadays, I can definitely see a sort of burgeoning, growing, strengthening China moving up from the border here and sort of trying to push up, because they've also basically taken Mongolia now, China have. So if you look at this vast border all the way along here, imagine China could take that border and make it more like this, straight up. There's an awful lot of natural resources, and they would love that. Because obviously they have very long-term plans, and long-term plans need large amounts of things like natural resources. So that's just my slightly conspiracy theory. That this definitely would work out for China, because if Russia do end up having to fight the West, that's going to weaken both sides, and obviously the West is in decline. That's something you can't really debate. Just look at the numbers. Be nice to think that it wasn't, but it is. So yeah, that would work out great for them. But another thing thing that I think people have been taken a little bit by surprise and shock because of is that, we've really been living in a bit of a dream world in the West, for the last, 50, 60 years. Like, we've definitely had serious bloody conflicts, but they've always been, pretty far away from home, and they've always been against relatively weak opposition. It was bad. Obviously, it was rough over in Iraq and Afghanistan. But if you're somebody out there and your support is an Apache, a couple of A-10s, and an AC-130, anyway, the gunship, the spooky gunships, and those are your allies, or you're the guy that's running around in a dress with an AK, one side is pretty heavily, has a much bigger advantage than the other side. So it's been a long time since it's been relatively equal sides going at it, and that would, I think that would really wake people up in a split second, because let's be honest, what do people talk about, and what are the things that people bicker about nowadays? It's certainly things that just really aren't particularly important, but they can be incredibly detrimental if they're allowed to fester. And I mean, it's interesting to me because countries like Russia and China definitely do not struggle with the same bizarre things that we have been struggling recently with. Something I say to my friends, both of them, is that however nice we want to be in the West, and however progressive everyone wants to be, and other countries do not think like that. And why should they? China is not thinking, how nice can we make the Kazakhstanis' lives? How progressive can we make the girls in Mauritania's lives? They don't think about that. The world, much as people would hope that it wasn't, is a dog-eat-dog world. And if you're not going to take that steak that's laying on the floor, somebody else is. And that's just a fact. So I think people are very shocked by this, and, it is shocking. But just because we've had a period of, a kind of dream world, doesn't change who humans are. Humans are the same now, roughly, as they were 100 years ago. And, we run the same sort of risk of things happening. But anyway, we'll do some updates when we know more. I think it's a very sad day. I know there are an awful lot of casualties already. I read somewhere in the region of 40 a side after the first 12 hours. So we'll see. But I know it's a little bit boring. Some people this wouldn't have been their thing. But for anybody else that is still watching, thank you, and I will see you again soon.
Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from cramp. He did not know what had made him pour out this stream of rubbish